Muito boa tarde a todos. Vamos, então, iniciar a segunda parte desse minicurso. Novamente digo, aqui é um grande prazer ter o professor Giovanni Dosi aqui entre nós. E vamos usufruir aqui da companhia dele nesta nova sessão sobre o curso de Technical Change, né? E um título longo, já não me lembro exatamente qual. Está ali, acho, né? Não, essa aqui é uma parte da apresentação, depois ele vai se dedicar, além dessa parte da apresentação, depois tem uma segunda parte onde ele vai se dedicar a um conjunto de modelos que ele tem trabalhado. Ontem tivemos, inclusive, a defesa do Marcelo Carvalho Pereira, da qual ele participou, e vários professores. Então, passo imediatamente a palavra para o professor Giovanni Dosi para essa segunda parte. Obrigado.
Como terça-feira eu vou falar em inglês, mas você pode perguntar em português. Today we are doing two things. We are going to zoom in. Tuesday we presented the broad evolutionary research program, at least as I see it and Sid Winter sees it. Flagging areas, questions, and especially making explicit the building blocks of the emerging paradigm. Today we zoom in at two opposite ends. One is technology and knowledge. This is an area in which evolutionary thinking is, or has been, dominant in the economic discipline. One of the few areas in which that was established by evolutionary analysts, Chris Freeman, Dick Nelson, Sid Winter, Rosenberg. Even if there is nowadays a sort of attempt to a sort of counter-reformation, in the sense that bits and pieces of our knowledge on innovation and technology are sort of trivialized and reincorporated within the paradigm, the dominant neoclassical paradigm. I mean, if you go and see the book published by MBR, when was it? 4 years ago, 3 years ago, The Rate and Direction of Innovative Activities 50 years after. That is, you remember Arrow Nelson, 1959. The Rate and Direction of Innovative Activities. We had a meeting organized by MBR. What happens 50 years after? You should take a look at it. There are significant signs of counter-reformation. I mean, apart from Dick Nelson, the only genuine evolutionary economist, it was me. And even me, I was asked to do a discussion of a paper, not to have a chapter, but to discuss a chapter. This gives you a measure of a danger that there is, I mean, of reincorporation and trivialization. Anyway, what is the state of the art of our knowledge in this area? Well, let's start from the observation that some quite straightforward observation, which nonetheless are not well digested by the theory so far. Well, behind the input-output relation, there are knowledge and organizational practices which are in a way the primitives of the interpretation. We shall see it later on. I mean, with my student, I say, well, suppose that you go to your grandmother and you ask, grandmother, how do I make a cake? And your grandmother replies, vector of 1 egg, 1 kilo flour, a spoon of butter, sugar, equal cake. Well, you say, grandmother went out of her mind, right? Well, if in addition, your grandmother that went to school is also going to tell you that the flour, the egg, the sugar, etc., can be combined according to an homogeneous function of degree 1, you call the ambulance, right? Because, for example, a cake with 99% butter is not a cake, right? Irrespective of relative prices. 99% of eggs make an omelette, not a cake. What do you take out of the story of this parable? First, I shall come back to that. That there is a fundamental procedural part of technology that has to do with how to do things, and is not summarized in the input-output relation. Second, there are heavy constraints to the input-output relation themselves. You cannot make a cake with 99% butter, irrespective of relative prices, right? And then the question that we'll try to address is, but what are these constraints and what are the organizational practices, and where does the knowledge from which they come from? In fact, you have got a great diversity of knowledge bases across production and innovative activities. In some activities, it is largely endogenously generated in the sector itself. In others, come from outside. For example, comes from suppliers. In others, yet come from science. And we shall try. Many of you know Pavel taxonomy. We shall try to taxonomize the sources of knowledge. And this is quite obvious, but again, it's obvious for non-economists. It's not so obvious for economists. You have an enormous diversity of procedure by which technological knowledge is exploited. And again, an interesting question is, can we find some structure in this procedure? Well, what I've been trying to do when I was young and beautiful, that is a few years ago, is trying to conceptualize the structure of technological knowledge in terms of technological paradigms, somewhat in analogy with Kuhn scientific paradigm. In fact, as it turns out, probably the notion of technological paradigm is more robust than the Kuhnian notion of scientific paradigm. What is a paradigm? Paradigm is based on selected physical or chemical principles and knowledge bases. It's based, say, on particular ways of transforming heat into motion, or of generating electricity, or transmitting information, or undertaking particular chemical reactions. And of course, I mean, there are many ways of transforming heat into motion. The steam engine is different from the internal combustion engine. And this, in fact, is related to the two different technological paradigms. Or there are different ways of processing information. You can do it with thermoionic valves. You can do it with semiconductors. You still process information, but the physical principles are very, very different. And so is the knowledge base associated with the two. In many paradigms, not all of them, but many paradigms are associated to a dominant idea of an artifact, to a dominant design. I mean, if you go to a museum of cars, you see cars, say, 1900, that are very different animals. Some you barely recognize them nowadays as a car. Nowadays, with the dominant paradigm established, if you ask any kid anywhere in the world to draw a design of a car, it will draw a car with 4 wheels, a chassis. The kids all over the world will draw the same car, which was not, because that is a dominant design. And you have got dominant design in television, fridges. When you have a dominant design, typically you have an established paradigm. The other way around is not true. For example, you don't have a dominant design in pharmaceuticals. You don't have the dominant molecule. Because, of course, you've got many diseases and many molecules. Even if you can have a paradigm associated with a specific knowledge basis, and with specific heuristics. What are heuristics? Heuristics are sort of rules that say, how do we search? Where do we go from here? Which orient also the search, the attention and the search of the technician and the engineers. I mean, in cars, you know that the frontier is having cars that are more fuel efficient, that are probably that is the dominant dimension on which research is focused nowadays. The where do we go from here in medical research has to do with the search of ways of searching receptors and matching this receptor with particular molecules. Paradigms don't live in the air, but are embodied in community of practices that are the community of engineers that are trained in the same technical schools, in the same universities, that share the basic training, the manuals, share the practices of search and design. I think paradigms are quite ubiquitous. It is, I cannot think of activities that are based on loose and very plastic, malleable knowledge. Indeed, most industrial activities are associated with relatively stable bodies of knowledge that have got the characteristics that I was saying before. What is a trajectory? The trajectory is, in a sense, the realization of the promise involved in the paradigm. Paradigm is a promise. Is a knowledge base and that entails a lot of opportunities of doing things. The realization of these opportunities, the fulfillment of these opportunities is indeed, you see a mark of the fulfillment in technological trajectories. Now, what are technological trajectories? A paradigm defines also the fundamental dimension of the artifacts and of the production processes. Take airplanes. What are the fundamental dimensions of airplanes? Well, they are wing load, takeoff weight, the number of passengers it carries, the gallons per kilo that it carries, how far it can fly. Now, if you go and map, Paolo Saviotti and others have done that, and earlier Sahal, Devendra Sahal. If you go and map different generations of artifacts, in this case airplane, you see them aligned along a quite precise trajectory that implying a relatively balanced improvement in all these characteristics. Again, it's not anything looking like an isoquant. It is, on the contrary, a sort of ray or sort of cylinder moving away from the origin. If you do it in the airplane, it's very clear, but you do it on automobiles, on helicopters, on tractors. You always find trajectory. In airplanes, you find two trajectories, one civilian and the other military, that are of course different. There is only one outlier, one observation that is in between the two, that is the Concorde, which in fact was a commercial failure. It was a technical success, but a commercial failure. The same in the space of input coefficient. In that case, I mean, if you take unit inputs, you observe, it has been less studied, but you observe relatively ordered movement toward the origin. Always in terms of labor use. That is, techniques become more and more productive in terms of labor productivity. But this is not compensated by an increase in capital output ratios. Why? Because you improve also the use of capital. In fact, in ICT, the effect is that you improve a lot both. So it's like moving toward the origin. The trajectory moves along the origin. But you've got labor and capital. You move like this toward the origin. Sometimes you don't move like this. You move like this in the sense that capital output ratio remain more or less constant, and labor efficiency increases. In any case, no one ever observes anything like an isoquant, ever. And if you do an empirical exercise that says, well, I have, sorry I don't have a blackboard, but say, firms are heterogeneous, right? So at each T, you will observe a cloud of points. Well, suppose that you take you take some average of these points at T. There'll be a point there. You can always draw some isoquant going through there, right? Even if you did not observe it, but say, let us assume, in a good economist way, that there is an isoquant. Time T plus 1, you'll have another cloud of points. You can always take the mean of this cloud of points and draw another isoquant. Then you say, let me disentangle how much of the movement from the first mean to the second mean is due to substitution along the isoquant that I draw, but I was not there, that I draw, and how much, and what is left over, I call it technical progress. This is totally misleading. In fact, the isoquant was not there in the first place. The points moved. Why did they move? They moved because some firms innovated, some firms imitated, some firms died, and some new firm entered. This is, in fact, I mean, if you do well the homework and you go and what I call evolutionary accounting, if you do evolutionary accounting, well, you can reconstruct how much the switch from mean at time 0 to the mean at time 2 is due to innovation and imitation, how much is due to selection, how much is due to death, how much is due to birth. And I think this is an important exercise, I mean, that people, when people does the empirics of industrial revolution, one should always start from there. So you observe labor productivity changes. Well, why labor productivity, I'll tell you in a sec, but why not total factor? Basically, because of your grandmother, because of the story of the grandmother. You don't want to do total factor productivity, because total factor productivity implies that you have got a movement of a function of an invariant functional form. So you have got you switch an invariant functional form that tells you how you can substitute inputs. Since you cannot substitute inputs, going and estimating a production function is a somewhat devious exercise and misleading. Well, so it is much better to use the simpler and more straightforward labor productivity. And this is the only thing that makes sense, because if firms live, so to speak, on different production functions, in fact, I mean, each firm lives on a general production function, lives on the point that it displays. It's not that a firm is full of drawers with different techniques that they take out of the drawer according to the relative prices. No. Drawers are empty. Firms know how to do what they do. And to do something else means innovating, means learning, but it's not there in the drawer. I'd say that. I mean, I'd be interested to see evolutionary accounting done well on Brazilian data. My guess is that you have the little productivity growth that you have is mainly due to learning, that is, to innovation or most likely imitation, and very little to selection, that is, competitive selection across firms that have got different level of efficiency. Even in China, this is the case. I mean, I have access with a postdoc of mine to the 20 years of Chinese data, and even in China, this is the case. What dominates is idiosyncratic, that is for firm-specific learning and not competitive selection in the market. Well, are there invariances in the way one proceeds along the trajectory? Well, often you have got phenomena of learning by doing, learning by using, learning by designing. You might know the famous Moore law that says that every 18 months or so, 2 years, the number of circuits on a number of transistors on a processor doubles. The standard way of representing learning by doing is a power law linking unit cost and cumulated production. But if you remember that production of microprocessor grows exponentially, the two are identical. I mean, the 2 boil down to the same. Basically, you have got great. This is going to hurt. Puoi collocare qui. Perfeito. Muito obrigado. Essentially, power law tells you that, call it unit cost, comes down with alpha to the x to the beta, with the x being the sum from 1 to t of production. Okay? This is quite general, this mechanism. That, well, of course, if you take the log, it becomes a straight line, right? Learning by doing was made, was formalized, conceptualized and formalized by Kenneth Arrow in his article in 1962, drawing on an obscure work, I think in Norwegian, on a steel mill called Arendal, in which they found that even holding the mill constant, I mean, even without any technical improvement in the equipment, productivity was growing 2% per year. It does not always happen always. It requires, in learning by doing, is the outcome of an explicit effort of learning. There are examples, especially in developing countries, of unlearning by doing. There are cases, Martin Belle studied them, I think, if I remember well, years and years ago, in which you had this aluminium smelter in Thailand, that when the foreign technician that had built it was functioning reasonably well, then the foreign technician went home and productivity started falling. So it was unlearning by doing. Anyway, this is just to say that is not, there is nothing automatic in the learning by doing process. Discontinuities in knowledge bases, which are those that I consider truly radical innovation, are associated with paradigm changes. When you go from valves to semiconductors, this is a paradigm change associated with the major discontinuity in knowledge. One, like, I mean, this has very little to do with the speed of change. I mean, technical progress within the semiconductor paradigm has been extremely fast. But that was on the ground, is on the ground of the same knowledge base. And therefore, I would not consider that a radical discontinuity. Can one identify dimensions of each knowledge base? Can one classify, in a way, paradigms? I mean, saying measuring is too much, but can one define specific characteristics? Like, I don't know, you classify animals according to whether they breathe air or not, they're mammals or not. Can you do something of a similar type of classification? Well, I think that there are at least 4 dimensions that distinguish each paradigm. One are the opportunities of innovation. There are paradigms that involve a lot of opportunities and other less. What is an opportunity? In a sense, you can think of it in 2 ways. One is, think of it as a lake full with fishes. One idea of opportunity is how dense is the lake with the fishes? Or put it in the other way around, how easy it is if you go fishing to draw a fish. New paradigms are always full of opportunities. Old paradigms tend to have less opportunity because often they tend to approach the physical or chemical limits of the physics or chemistry associated with that paradigm. The internal combustion engine has got its limit in the Carnot engine, that is the ideal engine, and you cannot go above that. The opportunities can also be defined in another way, that is how long is the jump that you can make conditionally on what you already know. Of course, if you double the density of the circuit of a microprocessor every 18 months, well, that is a significant jump. Opportunities are big. In other technologies, opportunities are much smaller. Just to flag it, there is, of course, a relation between the opportunities associated with the paradigm and the possible technology gaps across firms and across countries. Because if opportunities are high, the distance between the leader and the laggard might be very high indeed. Technologies differ in terms of degrees of tacitness associated with search and with the production of whatever that paradigm is meant to produce. Take again the case of your grandmother. Of course, the minimum that your grandmother can tell you in order to make the cake is precisely a procedural story. Put the butter in the pan, then put the flour, break the egg, etc., which is which is the story of the legal operation that you can do in order to make the cake. And this is the codified part. I mean, you can write it down, and there are books of recipes for that. Still, you are not going to be as good as your grandmother in making the cake, because there is a tacit part that is not written down, and basically you learn by making the cake with your grandmother. When I talk about these things in England, I say, well, look, there are so many books of Italian and French recipes that are translated into English. Still you eat shit, because there is the tacit part there that you never learned. The tacitness is between good food and bad food, given the recipe. Of course, there are activities that are extremely tacit, others that are less so. We shall see when we talk about we shall talk about taxonomies of sectors and paradigms, that typically in these sectors where knowledge is to a good extent incorporated into the machines, and you have got only to learn how to use them, they are relatively less tacit than those in which you have got to do yourself the thing on the ground of an ill-specified search heuristic. Production of machine tools. Production of machine tools is an extremely tacit activity. Even with the numerical control, the machining center, etc., is still a relatively tacit activity. If you want to go down to very low tolerances of the drilling machine, the boring machine, delays, etc., this remains a very tacit, and in fact, I mean, all over the world, the leadership is Germany, gross Germany, including Switzerland, Sweden, Northern Italy, and Japan. There is the places where top-level machine tools are produced. And note, for example, Germany, it has been expropriated twice of all the patents, etc., but has remained the leader in machine tools for 100 and something years. Of course, again, the degree of tacitness is inversely related to the degree of transferability of innovation, and also to the degree in which you can copy. Something is very tacit, it's very difficult to copy. There is nowadays a discussion in Italy, you know, in Cremona, they produce violins. Basically, they've got the world monopoly of production of violins. And to produce a top-level violin, it requires 10, 15 years of training. Now, historically, people that arrived in Cremona and stayed there all their life producing violins. Should the violin school in Cremona accept Chinese students? Because everyone knows the Chinese go home and learn how to make the violins, and then they go home and teach other people to make the violins. Should the school discriminate against the Chinese? And that is the question. I don't know what answer they came up to, but violin making is one of the most tacit activities in the world. Tacitness relates to cumulativeness. What is cumulativeness? It's the degree to which you learn on the top of what you already know. Highly cumulative activities are activities that are very incremental. Look at Intel in microprocessors. The continuous leadership of Intel suggests a very cumulative process of learning. Each generation of microprocessor are Intel, little bit AMD, but is an international duopoly. This reveals a very high degree of cumulativeness. Technologies differ in terms of the degrees and forms of appropriability. What is appropriability? Well, is the ability to appropriate some economic benefit, some economic return from the innovation itself. There are activities that are non-appropriable. For example, agricultural research up till the hybrid seed in the 50s was not appropriable in the sense that you came up with a better variety, you sold to the peasant, and then the peasants were selling them themselves. I mean, they would not come back to you. And in fact, a good deal of research was done in public institutions, land-grant colleges in the US, INPA in Italy and France, that were non-profit institutions because the appropriability was zero. There are different forms of appropriability in modern industries. One is associated precisely with tacitness. Tacitness essentially means that even if you can have my product in your hand, you don't have my knowledge to produce it. Second, appropriability might be associated with the complexity of the product itself. I mean, an Airbus. Imitating an Airbus is a complicated thing. I mean, you've got, you can do reverse engineering, but you've got to tear it apart, and there are millions of components in an Airbus. Secrecy. Especially for process innovation, secrecy is a quite effective way of appropriating it. And finally, patents. But patents, remember, are only one of the mechanisms of appropriation and not the important one in most sectors. The inquiries done in the United States and in Europe show that patents are not considered by firms themselves as the top appropriating mechanism, with one or two exceptions, especially drugs, pharmaceuticals. Now, here is important to open a parenthesis because it's fundamental with respect to the current discussion on intellectual property right. We said before that in capitalist economies, you need to have some form of appropriation in order to have a private profit-seeking agent undertaking research, expensive research. But is there monotonicity in the relation between innovative effort and appropriability? That is, if you make something more appropriable, do people double or increase in any case their research effort? The answer is no. On the contrary. In fact, the US are the best quasi-natural experiment because both the legislation and the judicial practices changed around 1980, increasing the width of the patent, the width and the breadth of the patent. And you could patent, nowadays you can patent, I mean, I was saying a while ago a patent that said this is for a hemoglobin receptor or for other receptors that I don't know yet. What? You're patenting something that you don't know yet. You've got to be crazy. So the width, the breadth, and the domains. I mean, now you can patent business models. You can patent genes. With some, no, there is a little reverse. Did that increase the rate of innovation? No. It has increased the rate of patenting, but not the rate of innovation. Estimate by Browning Hall and colleagues show that the increase is due to bad patents. Has led to patent thickets, that is, you bunch up a lot of patents so that you take other people at ransom and say, well, you are producing that piece of paper. I think you are infringing a patent that I have on the pen. And so they're essentially the instrument to extract rents with the rate of innovation that actually fell. Well, other are silly. Last time that Sid Winter looked at this patent category, there were a few hundred patents on how to exercise your cat. To make your cat down. So beware when you play with your cat, because you are almost like infringing a patent. Huh? Be very careful. The estimate of the US Department of Commerce suggests that the expenditure for litigation on patents is equal to 1/3 of the US private R&D budget. 1/3. 1/3 goes to the lawyers. That is, the US firms spend for lawyers more or the same as the entire Germans spend for research. It's good for lawyers, but not for society. And this even more so applies to developing countries. I mean, I think we were already saying it the other day, all episodes of successful development in the past occurred under weak regime of intellectual property rights. Because catching up countries were there essentially to imitate. And the patent is there to prevent imitation. The idea that patents are good for technology transfer because then you can transfer, you can license, is wrong. The major mechanism of technology transfer has always been imitation. Well, there's been also some licensing, of course, but that has never been the main mechanism. So, under the TRIP, the current international agreement on intellectual property right, other things being equal, the TRIP agreement are detrimental to development. Never forget that. The current intellectual property rights, sorry if I take a bit more on that, but I think it's important. Joe Stiglitz, myself, and others are fighting battles a bit like Don Quixote, but against the current regime of intellectual property rights that is detrimental also in developed countries, especially where patents count. In most sectors, they don't count very much. I was saying in pharmaceutical, they do count. Now, in pharmaceutical is the most misaligned structure of research and protection of research. How many new chemical entities do you think each year are approved by the Food and Drug Administration of the US? New chemical entity meaning something really new, that cure a curable disease in a very different way, or that cure a disease that before was not curable. Each year patents are thousands and thousands. New chemical entities approved by the FDA are between 15 and 25. Why? Because big pharma don't care. They realize that cancer is too difficult, and it's very idiosyncratic. Cancer, there are dozens of genes associated in one particular type of cancer. So there is no blockbuster there, with some exception. Novartis with Gleevec. And in fact, they charge, I don't know how much they charge here, they charge in Italy, the National Health System, $70,000 per patient per year. But basically what Big Pharma does is invent around existing molecule for diseases of rich and old people. Heart diseases, etc. Even Alzheimer, that is very diffused among rich and old people, is too difficult. So they don't do much research on Alzheimer. They could find a blockbuster on Alzheimer, but it's too difficult. The proposal that Joe Stiglitz and I make, with zero probability of being accepted, because it'd be like the Russian Revolution of the 1917, is the following. Well, you have got basically three stages. You have got a stage of research in which, very exploratory, in which you identify possible chemical entities and possible receptors. This stage is basically all paid by the public. National Institute of Health, Pasteur, etc., etc. And is done mostly in public institutions. Then, if there is an entity that is somewhat promising, under the current institutional regime after the Bayh-Dole Act, the university can give it to either a biotech firm or big pharma. They do search in vitro, then on animals. If they pass this stage, which is not very expensive, they go to the third stage. They say, wow, this is the expensive one, that is experiment on human. Experiment on human that is done, though, In Europe, 95% in public hospitals, with all the overheads that are paid by the public, on patients that are patients treated by the public. And even in the US, it's 50%. So we are paying the first part. We are paying a good deal of the testing under terrible condition of conflict of interest. There are companies that are specialized, this is what their self-definition, in massaging the data. Massaging the data is at the limit of the fraud, massaging the data. And sometimes they come out. I saw application to the Food and Drug Administration, Smirnov Kolmogorov test against placebo on 19 observations. I mean, if a PhD student comes to me and does show me this test, they say, come back when you know statistics. Smirnov Kolmogorov on distribution, 19 observations against 20. And they are significantly different, therefore it works. Then, of course, you get here, big pharma start producing it and sells it to whom? To me, to the state again, with the markup over the entire story. So I pay twice. I pay a good deal of the research, the overhead of the hospital, and then I pay the drug. The idea of Joe and I and others is very simple. Let's have the public go all more or less. And so antibiotics should cost like beer, not more. And that would be a reform at negative cost. But I mean, the probability that it passes is zero. Close parenthesis, but I think it's an important point. I think knowledge and technological practices do not live in the thin air. In fact, they live to a good extent in organizational routines and organizational knowledge. This is where the theory of innovation technology links up with the theory of the firm. And the evolutionary theory of the firm is a capability-based theory of the firm. So in premise, a firm is an ensemble of problem-solving capabilities. And a capability base of the firm, incidentally, is able to explain both the vertical boundaries and the horizontal boundary of the firm. That is, the scope of diversification and the degrees of vertical integration. While transaction cost theory at most explain the vertical boundaries and don't explain it well. Because it explains both, because the applicability of a certain knowledge base delimits the scope of diversification of the firm. And these things can also be formalized. They are, I think, this idea implies good, robust interpretive heuristics, but also can be formalized, and one can explore, I don't know whether search is more effective, that is more hierarchical, less hierarchical. How do you divide labor within the organization, etc. Those of you interested can the qualitative part you can find in a survey of the capability-based theory of the firm in a Dosi, Faillo, Marengo, Organization Studies, 2008 maybe. And those interested in the form of a survey on the formalization of all this, there is a Dosi, Faillo, Marengo, Moschella on the Seoul Journal of Economics of 4 years ago. Well, the firms that embody different knowledge based on different technological paradigms compete in specific industries. In turn, these industries, the form of competition depends also on the way firms learn, if they learn at all. With Marcelo, we are currently modeling different competition processes conditional on different processes of learning of the firm. Say at one extreme there is you can think of what one calls often Schumpeter Mark I, is the idea of the heroic entrepreneur that arrives as a new ways of doing things or new products and produces them, and that's it. So learning at the industry level is associated with entry. When one has entered, does not learn any longer, at least they're waiting for a new heroic entrepreneur to come along. The opposite extreme, learning might be very cumulative. If learning is very cumulative, those that were better today are going to be better tomorrow. There you can understand competition is different and might lead to much higher concentration because success breeds success. So this is the first way of classifying industries in terms of the degree to which firms learn as opposed to innovation carried by entrants. You can classify industry also in terms of where the knowledge comes from and how search is done. And this is basically Pavi's taxonomy, Pavi's 1984 taxonomy. That classifies, it has got four basic categories. You have got supplier-dominated sectors. Supplier-dominated sectors are those in which innovation comes essentially incorporated in machines and intermediate inputs. So it's not you that generates the innovation, but the one that produces the machine. Textile, clothing, simple mechanical engineering belong to this category. Well, then there are the specialized suppliers, the second category, that is those that produce these machines. The distinction is, I mean, the categorization is not, are not clear partition, and there is a good deal of overlapping, but even in biological taxonomization you have this. Not all birds fly, etc., etc. Then you have science-based sectors, that, as the word says, are sectors in which they are near relatively recent science, from a good deal of ICT to bioengineering, nanotechnology, etc. These are they are associated with relatively recent science. And finally, scale intensive. That, as the word says, economies of scale are important. I like to distinguish scale intensive into continuous and discontinuous processes, because continuous processes typically have got a very simple output that exploits economies of scale, I don't know, refinery, steel, aluminium, bricks, and discontinuous in which the product is typically complex. Automobiles, television, fridges. These different animals do research in different ways. Some do research typically the science-based do search in a formalized way. They've got their R&D lab, etc. The opposite extreme, specialized supplier, is essentially learning by doing and by using. And they do very little R&D. Specialized supplier do some R&D, but mostly is learning by designing and learning by interacting with the user. If you buy this taxonomy with all the limits, but then you realize also that a sheer measure, I don't know, say, it has got a high R&D intensity, no, the other, in order to be high-tech, it has got to have a high R&D intensity. No, not necessarily. Or the silly bureaucrats in the Lisbon Memorandum in Europe saying we have got to get to 3% R&D over GDP. It depends on the activity. I mean, if you do 3% in pharmaceuticals, you are totally fucked because you should do 25. In shoemaking, you don't do R&D. So it depends on the activity. Saying we want to get to 3% R&D is a statement by someone that does not know how the industry works. Challenges, and I end with this. How do technological and organizational innovation relate to each other? For example, how the electronic-based automation of production processes relate to the organization of firms. How do technological discontinuities relate to organizational discontinuities? Typically, not typically, often new paradigms are discovered by incumbent firms, but are not exploited by incumbent firms. The transistor was developed at the Bell Laboratories, but the firms that exploited it, well, Shockley went his own way, established very early on his own firm. But then, say, the sons and grandsons of Shockley were not incumbent firm. Even if incumbent firm tried to enter the field. I mean, you had as early as 1952 or 53, you had Philco Ford that entered it. And the name is already a program. What did Philco Ford do? Let's have the assembly line for transistors. When they finished the assembly line for transistors, nobody wanted this transistor, not even for free. So at the time of emergence of new paradigms, generally you have got organizational discontinuities. Not always, but especially on the frontier you have. In catching up countries, more rarely. In catching up countries, you have got typically incumbent that imitate. Think of Toshiba, of the big Samsung. They were essentially incumbent oligopolistic firms. But in general, this issue of the relation between technological discontinuities and organizational discontinuity, I think, is a challenging issue, challenging and frontier issue that has obviously also important normative implication, because if you say that the new is carried by new firms, then you should have put in place mechanisms that favor the emergence of new firms. Most often this is not the case, especially in catching up countries. And in fact, you should put in place a mechanism making firm learn more, rather than fostering the entry of new as such. Another challenge that we are working also on that, to have a knowledge stroke procedure-centered theory of production. That is, instead of having this silly production function, activity analysis, etc., you'd like to have a representation of production in which the primitives are ensembles of acts, both physical and cognitive acts. And input-output relations are only a byproduct of this procedure, or are associated with this procedure. It's like, the recipe of the cake of your grandmother, in which there are physical inputs, but the story is a procedural story. There are issues that relate to, or at least should relate also to business economics. Right? What is the relationship between organizational practices and performances? How replicable are routines within and across organization, because this obviously has got to do with the replicability of knowledge, if you believe the story that I've been telling you so far. And we were discussing this already the other day. As these firms compete with each other at the end, what is the importance of idiosyncratic knowledge, idiosyncratic learning versus market selection in driving industry dynamics? And on what does market competition select? Does it select only on prices and productivities? Of course, it selects also on product quality, product characteristics. How does one formalize all that? Because at the end, I mean, again, this is very important to understand market dynamics and industrial dynamics. When you observe the evolution or non-evolution of an industry, then you ask, but why? What are the drivers of this industry? Seems to me that the Brazilian industry is a bit like the Italian one, very little moves. It has been, since the year 2000, the Italian industry appears to be paralyzed. Why? The answer that tentative answer that we come up is not so much a matter of lack of competition, but is a lack of firm level learning. Anyway, all this with the ultimate goal of offering an alternative micro-foundation to macroeconomics, to macrodynamics. And in fact, in the second part of this day, I would like to present to you some of these alternative macroeconomics. Can you switch me to the... What we do, I mean, is you can find it on you can find it as a LAM working paper on our website. Well, you find the predecessor of this published, a couple are published, 3 now are published on the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control. And they come under the heading, the family is Schumpeter meeting Keynes. Now, basically, well, I give you the intuition. An agent-based evolutionary model, we were already talking about it the other day. An agent-based evolutionary model is a model that is populated by heterogeneous agents that learn or don't learn, compete with each other, sell, buy, and the interaction among them produces the aggregate regularities that you observe. Maybe we have an engineer here, right? Marcelo, I think we need the engineer here. And then you see engineers are. Sometimes engineers are useful, right? Very well. We had a recession, at least in the developed country. We had a big recession, to which many countries, not the United States, but many countries reacted introducing austerity policies, especially in Europe. Now, the result were that the GDP of the developed country remained, even now, is at the level with Germany is the same as before the crisis. The US is a bit higher than before the crisis. The Europeans are below, after almost 10 years, are below the pre-crisis level. The recovery appears to be jobless, at least in Europe. And you have this strange schizophrenia between fiscal and innovation policy, etc. We should innovate, but at the same time you should tighten your belt, which I imagine that is also what you are going to face with your new Minister of the Economy here. Now, why disastrous policies? I think that the bad policies were guided by misleading theories. Indeed, in my view, in our view, the economic crisis has also been the crisis of economic theory, as Alan Corman puts it. Even if a good deal of the profession is in a total denial mode. Now, can we devise and think of alternative policies for complex evolving economies? Now, what I'll try to show in the rest of the presentation is that austerity kills also the exploitation of Schumpeterian potential of innovation and growth, that austerity reduces such potential, and at the same time increase GDP volatility and unemployment. That is, in a word, austerity policies are self-defeating. These are the papers that I was mentioning, that if you're interested, you find much more of it. The model. You have got a model in which you've got a government that levies taxes and gives an employment benefit, and in case bails out banks. You've got banks, banks that stock deposit, lend to firms, own government bonds. You have got two sectors, two production sectors. One production sector that produces final goods using labor and machines, and the capital good firms that perform R&D, sells machines to consumption good firms. Easy, right? You have got a labor force that consumes all its wages. Capitalists don't consume, only invest or save. Remember, this is just a simplifying assumption. as long as you keep the Cambridge assumption that capitalists save more than workers, everything works. And this is a reasonable assumption, right? The sequence of macro decisions of microeconomic decisions is the following: bank fix the maximum credit supply. Capital goods firm perform R&D, innovate and imitate. Firm ask for credit based on their desired investment plans. The machines are paid in advance. Production begins and firms hire correspondingly workers to undertake this production. Production is made, the consumption good markets open, they get their money from selling their goods, firm repay their debt, bank profit and equity are computed accordingly, some firm die, some firm enter. The machines, and finally the machines ordered at the beginning of the period are delivered at the end of the period. Easy, right? Well, this model, if for those of you that are interested, go and get a CD, the 3 papers that I suggested, especially look at the first one, the Schumpeter meeting Keynes, 2010. This model is able to generate a long series of stylized facts that is able to reproduce the microeconomics and the macroeconomics that we saw in the first lecture. You remember skewed size distributions, tent shape, processes of growth of firms, all the way to business fluctuations, growth and fluctuation, crisis, co-movement of GDP, investment, consumption, etc. So it's able to reproduce as emergent properties all these phenomena. Now, this is a sign of robustness of this model. Because I mean, and I think that the ability to reproduce at the same time multiple stylized facts is a good criterion of validation of a model. And it does so for a wide range of parameterization. So it's not that you look for the parameter, the 1.46, that is the one that makes you get the result, otherwise the system collapses. No. Now, encouraged by that, by this ability of reproducing empirical stylized fact, you can use the model to do policy experiment. I mean, you're God, you created the world. Now you can use it as saying, well, I pull this lever here, I pull this lever there, I turn off these things. So it is a world in which you can experiment with policy and see what happens. Now, in the baseline of this model, there is a Schumpeterian dynamic that is the search by machine tool firms that search for more efficient machines or more efficient way of producing the machines. And these machines diffuse in the consumption goods sector. This is, in a way, the very simple Schumpeterian mechanism in the model. You have also a Keynesian mechanism of demand stabilization, and again, it's very rudimentary. You have a government that taxes profits and pay unemployment benefits. This is the baseline model. And this baseline model is the one that does all the things that I was telling you before, reproduces the stylized facts, etc. Now, let us compare this baseline model with a model in which policies are different. In the baseline model, you have automatic stabilizer and you have no limit to public deficit. Even if you parameterize in such a way that on average the public deficit is zero. But you don't have any technical limit to, so during the cycle deficit can go up and then come down. Let's introduce into the model, the same model, introduce what in Europe is called the Stability and Growth Pact. Growth, I mean, it's like, again, European politicians are misuse words. So that you have a constraint, deficit over GDP should not exceed 3%. And you have got a fiscal compact. Fiscal compact meaning that you have got the Stability and Growth Pact plus a rule for debt reduction. We experiment with that, then we modify it and we introduce an escape clause that says the Stability and Growth Pact and the Fiscal Compact do not apply during period of crisis. And we also study sovereign bonds. If the spread on sovereign bonds adjusts to the ratio of public debt to GDP. Monetary policies, we have a baseline conservative Taylor rule that adjusts interest rate as a function of the inflation gap, or a Taylor rule, say an expansion, a dual mandate Taylor rule that adjusts interest rate with the target of inflation, but also with the target of employment. Now, what happens? Without escape clauses, the fiscal rule, that is the Stability Growth Pact, and the Compact, reduce systematically growth and lock the economy in the long term in a lower growth trajectory. SGP means Stability and Growth Pact, FC is Fiscal Compact, SGP is the austerity policy, but with the recession clause that do not apply during recession. The column are Taylor rule and Taylor rule double mandate. You compare the average rate of growth with the baseline one, the one that I was defining before. As you can see, under Stability Growth Pact and Fiscal Compact, look at the first column, the long-term rate of growth become half. Long-term. Austerity has a detrimental effect, not only cyclical detrimental effect, it has an effect on the long term. And monetary policy is basically irrelevant. Volatility. With and without escape clauses, the austerity fiscal rule always lead to higher volatility. So the austerity leads to deeper recessions. Lower long-term average rate of growth and deeper recession. And higher incidence of crisis. You see, these are the frequencies of fall of GDP of more than 3%. And under the austerity policy, the frequency almost doubles. Higher unemployment rate shoots up. The unemployment rate under austerity is 5 times the unemployment rate than in the baseline model. Curbed there if you have a dual mandate monetary policy, essentially because with the dual mandate monetary policy pumps credit into the economy when it is needed. Interestingly, fiscal rules that have the main objective, I mean, you have got with a little finger Angela Merkel, you should behave. You have got debt but must be repaid, and the debt GDP ratio should be lower. Interestingly, austerity policies are self-defeating also in that domain. With austerity, the debt to GDP ratio is double that you'd have without austerity. Why? Because here, as in the real world, you have got multipliers that are greater than 1. And if they're much greater than 1, if you cut expenditure by 1, that is, you cut the numerator, you cut the denominator of the fraction by a lot more. And therefore the deficit and the debt increases. They're not decreased. You can experiment with different income distribution. Right? You can make the above experiments on different markup levels that here in this simple model are proxies for functional income distribution. Of course, the lower the markup rate, the higher is the firm financial dependence, the more credit constrains firm production and investment decision. And the larger are the bank and bank bailout costs. With low markups, credit policies are important because credit policies affect the ability of firms to invest, because they don't have a very big cash flow, firms. But low markup are also associated with more stable economies if credit policies are expansive. Higher markups reduce aggregate demand. Remember that the worker are those that consume. Paving the way to higher economic instability and worsening public finance. And with high markups, that is with more unequal income distribution, monetary policy tend to be ineffective. Austerity rules lock the economy in a low growth, high instability trajectory. And the negative effects of the austerity rules increase with inequality. Because intuitively, with high inequality, monetary policy is ineffective. Fiscal policy is very effective. Yeah. Which one? I don't see any. I see a blinking red, but
this one here, the eye.
okay. So you can see that as you increase the markup, the average growth rate is very sensitive to austerity policies. The likelihood of economic crisis increases in the baseline, and even more so under austerity. Unemployment shoots up, and unemployment tends to be higher even in the baseline with more unequal income distribution, but gets much higher under austerity policies. Well, escape clauses mitigate. Escape clauses mitigate because the escape clause essentially says you don't apply austerity policies when you normally would apply them. So that mitigates the effect of the austerity policy. Long-run growth is preserved, but the economy is still more unstable. Look at this compared to the baseline. Results do not change even if you take into account a positive feedback between the ratio between public debt and the spread on government bonds. That is, if you take into account, say, the Italy effect, that Italy has a spread that is higher than the Bund, the German Bund. Basically, the results do not change. Dual mandate, monetary policy reduces GDP volatility, unemployment, and the likelihood of crisis for relatively low markup levels. Then it becomes, in fact, not so effective. And you should expect that because the Taylor rule operates essentially by the credit channel. But when markup are high, firms are not credit constrained because they're full of money. And so monetary policy is ineffective. And it is fiscal policy that works. Remember, this model was meant, having in mind Europe. But there are a lot of implications about concerning the Brazilian economy too. And in fact, it's a story that could easily be told on Brazil, with its high income inequality, with the effectiveness of fiscal policy, and therefore the bad effect that you are going to have by a restrictive fiscal policy that you are going to implement. Dual mandate policies slightly increase inflation, but who cares? But it increases the interest rate whenever unemployment is low, thus improving bank profitability, and via Basel rules, it increased the supply of credit to the firm. To repeat, here we don't have any monetarist equation, we don't have anything of that sort. Everything works through the credit channel. There is no quantitative theory of money or silly things of that sort. Simply, monetary policy and variation of the interest rate affect the balance sheet of the banks, their ability to lend credit to the firms, and the cost of credit to the firms, and therefore also the ceiling on the maximum credit that they can obtain. That's all. Monetary policy, if it has an effect, is through that channel. To repeat, and you were already seeing it in the data, austerity has a long-term effect. The absence of Keynes kills Schumpeter. Why? How? Well, via two mechanisms. That if the economy is in recession, they buy less machine tools. By buying less machine tools, the income of the machine producer is lower. They do less R&D, and therefore the rate of search and the rate of innovation is lower. Not only, but if you have recession, the rate of diffusion of innovation is lower because downstream firms buy less machines. And this has long-term effects, as you can see. The two rates of growth diverge, both in productivity and in GDP. Yeah. It's a big change. I've already said it. If you look at the statistics on employment created and employment destroyed under the under the the baseline and the austerity. In the austerity, it looks as if you have more flexibility, more competition, more. It's simply you've got more disruption. It's not, the rule of the labor market do not change. The bigger turbulence that you see is simply due to the fact that you have got a much bigger turbulence in the economy. Don't take that for flexibility, and even less so, don't claim that more flexibility will lead to higher rate of growth. The apparent paradox is that the dispersion of productivity across firms falls. And then you say, well, you see, this is creative destruction at work. No, it's not creative destruction at work. It's the fact that the rate of innovation is lower. Don't take the evidence of a shrinking support of the distribution in productivity in the recession as a case for successful creative destruction. On the contrary, it's simply the fact that, say, the upper tail of the distribution basically moves much slower. Due to the lower expected demand, firm investment rate falls. The slower creation and diffusion of innovation imply that the best vintages stay undisputed for a longer period, and productivity frontier evolves more slowly. To repeat, I've already said it, income inequality has an effect on both short-term and long-term dynamics, and on the relative effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policies. To repeat again, with high inequality, monetary policies tend to be ineffective because monetary policy work via the credit channel and therefore affect cash flows, are affected by cash flow. If firms have high enough cash flow, they don't need credit, and therefore monetary policy does not have any effect. The message: fiscal rules harm GDP growth, increase volatility, unemployment, likelihood of crisis. Austerity is self-defeating and may lead to sovereign debt crisis. That is austerity that determines the crisis, not vice versa. And this is it. I presented it, they invited me and they presented it at the Bundesbank. You can imagine the reaction there. Well, question on both. I mean, let's begin on question on the first part, and then we can, or as you like, we can also begin here. Have this.
só queria ver se você talvez pudesse desenhar, eu não sei se ficou claro quando você mexeu as mãos, a diferença da questão das trajetórias e de andar sobre as isoquantas, que você não está, a trajetória ela praticamente é perpendicular às isoquantas. Eu não sei se isso está claro para todo mundo, eu sei que para você, mas se você não tinha talvez você pudesse desenhar o que você quis dizer, porque eu acho que é uma coisa interessante.
So, suppose that we have got, as usual, L and K. These are unit labor input and unit capital input, which is input per unit of output. What you typically observe at one particular time is a cloud like this. Now, as I was saying, you can always take the mean, this is the point, and you are free also to draw something convex through that. Even if you don't see it, there what you see is a cloud of points. Now, the following year, you've got another cloud. You are always free to find a mean and draw another line. Then, what do you do? Well, you did your homework well, you say that. At time t0, relative prices were these. At time t1, relative prices are these. Then I go essentially and estimate a production function of the form yt is equal at times kt to the alpha to the lt to 1 minus alpha, right? And I impute part of the change from here to here to the movement in relative prices, and the rest I call technical progress, which, as Mo Abramovich used to say, this is not the measure of technical progress, but is the measure of the ignorance of the economist. The entire exercise is faulty, as you can see, because what is happening here is that you have a movement from this cloud to this cloud which has very little to do with any dynamic of substitution. Not have any substitution. The action did not involve any substitution over there. And if you had saving of labor or saving of capital, this is essentially due to technical progress. It's not any there is no substitution. There is the improved efficiency. And this is the basic story. And then, I mean, on that story, you can do, instead of doing this, you can do what I call, what I was saying, evolutionary accounting. You're saying, if the mean goes from there to there, how much is it due to the fact that the market selected in the best and selected out the worst? And how much is it due to the fact that incumbent learned? And typically the answer is it is due to learning. There are some estimates, in fact, in which the effect of selection is negative. That is, the market selects in the bad. Which is a bit problem also for our modeling, right?
Bem, a economia evolucionária avançou bastante nos últimos anos, a gente vê os modelos sendo utilizados para outras coisas cada vez mais, a gente vê modelos que antes eram bem teóricos, trabalhando apenas com mimetização de comportamento, trabalhando com moda, agora eles já conseguem reproduzir coisas sofisticadas. Para os próximos anos, aí para frente, a agenda da economia evolucionária, quais são os gaps que tem para ser preenchido, quais são os pontos aí que você acha fundamental ainda a gente passar, que precisam ser resolvidos? E eu gostaria de apontar para uma questão teórica também, que é uma coisa que tem bastante dificuldade. Você está falando no primeiro dia que a gente sempre foi uma economia estática, então o tempo nunca teve importância. Então a gente nunca discutiu qual é o papel do tempo, qual é o papel da periodicidade, né, na economia. Time, how the time proceeds. Até no modelo que você passa, tem, por exemplo, o modelo ele repercute por 300, por 400 períodos, por exemplo. Qual a representação disso? O que está sendo discutido na literatura a respeito de como a gente pode interpretar o tempo? Porque eu jogo os modelos ali para rodar no LSD e depois você faz um número X de vezes para rodar esse experimento, de turnos do experimento, e no final você chega no resultado que você quer da indústria. Como que eu faço uma analogia desse tempo com o mundo real? Mesmo porque também no experimento a gente trabalha com questão, eles são burros, né? Eles não pensam na frente, eles não são teleológicos, eles simplesmente reagem. Então, seria duas perguntas mesmo. Como a literatura está avançando na relação do tempo, no uso do tempo na economia, e quais seriam aí os principais gaps a serem preenchidos nos próximos anos pela teoria evolucionária?
Well, let me begin by the first. I mean, what are the frontiers? There are many frontiers. There are micro frontiers that have to do with essentially the interpretation of industrial dynamics. What are, first of all, the patterns of industrial evolution in terms of productivity growth, dispersion in growth, growth of firms, relationship between efficiency and growth, profitability and growth. What are the characteristics of the fast-growing firms? I was today on the telephone with Gary Pisano from Harvard and some people from the US Bureau of Census, because we try to mount a project precisely on this using also the US data. So the anatomy of industrial dynamics, we are only beginning now. And trying to reconstruct the feedbacks between productivity, innovation, investment, growth. This, I think, is a major frontier. Another one related to this one is labor creation, labor destruction. I mean, I did not have time to. the compensation effects. What is the ultimate effect of technical progress? I mean, on the one side, technical progress saves on labor, on the other hand, increases productivity, lower prices, and creates new goods. What is the balance between the two effects, and how does it change over time? Which in turn implies an analysis of income and price elasticities of the various commodities, old and new, and the composition of consumption baskets. These are very classical questions that we should start asking again. A frontier of evolutionary theorizing that we tackled every now and then by words, but not so much formally, is development. So having models of evolutionary models of development which take into account explicitly a north-south dimension and a modern versus informal economy dimension. It is possible to do them, but we have not done them yet. Another frontier in which we are working again with Marcello is labor markets. Different institutional setups of the labor market must have effect both on income distribution and on the dynamics that we were talking about before. I think that this is where evolutionary economics meets, say, more institutionalist thinking, regulation, etc., à la French. Micro. It might be time to look again at the micro-heuristic. How do firms set prices? How do firms decide to invest or not invest? How do they allocate resources to R&D? And these are empirical questions. One has got to partly look into data, but to a good extent one has got to get the hands dirty and go out there. I think that the research within the economics of innovation is the characterization of paradigms, trajectories, is far from exhausted. Understanding, for example, if there are new paradigms emerging in green technologies, in nanotechnologies, and also the characterization of the old ones. Not much work has been done since the 90s, since the late 80s, early 90s. Again, in the field of the economics of innovation, very few people have studied diffusion. Maybe with the exception of Comyn at MIT, at Harvard, that does it in his own way. Diffusion has not been very much studied because, after all, who cares if you make a model in which the diffusion is instantaneous, then you don't care about the static diffusion, right? And macro models have instantaneous diffusion. This is the only way they work. And then there is this enormous macro field, which we are trying to fight our battle, but there are so many things that can be done on this. Studying transmission mechanism, multipliers, what determines them, more sophisticated ways of introducing the credit channel in the economy, having saving explicitly in the model. All these things, I think, are urgent because at the end of the day, my feeling is that the battle is won or lost at macro level. So people can come along and say, yes, yes, you are right, innovation is nice, but then you have got to do austerity policy because to keep your house in order. If you want also to innovate. Good. So that battle is fundamental. And I think Schumpeterian people do not appreciate it because there is a good deal of Schumpeterian that are right-wing Schumpeterian. I'd say they're true Schumpeterian. If you read the book review that Schumpeter wrote of the general theory by Keynes, could have been written by a mediocre Chicago PhD. He did not understand the fuck all of the general theory, and he was all supply side. We need a case beyond Schumpeter in a way. This is for the partial answer to the first question. Time is what is the relationship between that time and our time? I don't know. I mean, in fact, I mean, we are very careful and we say periods. We don't call them years or. It's very difficult to have a precise matching between the time scale of these models and the time scale of the real world. Certainly the phenomena that emerge on a similar time scale than those that you observe yearly. Yearly because you have got yearly statistics. You might observe also another time scale, but we typically have yearly statistics, and this phenomenon, and the phenomena of the real world looks like these ones.
Boa tarde, professor. Meu nome é Christopher. Fico muito contente de poder ter a oportunidade de ver uma palestra do senhor, até porque os seus trabalhos, os seus artigos são muito lidos por nós na nossa formação, então eu acho que para mim é um prazer. E minha pergunta ela tem mais que ver com relação à sua opinião, com relação ao processo de desenvolvimento dos países em desenvolvimento e como que esses países, principalmente a América Latina ou até mesmo o Brasil, como que o senhor vê a possibilidade desses países tornarem-se mais inovadores e, consequentemente, passarem da etapa de catching up para se tornarem países desenvolvidos. E, em conjunto a isso, pensar se as leis de patente ou até as leis de patente internacional seriam um dos elementos a serem tratados para tornar esse salto, digamos assim, mais efetivo.
Well, I think that first of all, one needs to catch up. I'm not so excited about my friend Carlotta Perez that says that transition across paradigms always offer windows of opportunities for catching up countries to avoid, in a sense, to avoid the catch up, but jump on the new paradigms. I find it very rarely that happened. And when it happened together with the catching up in the old technology. I mean, think of the experience of the United States in the 19th century or Germany in the 19th century. They were not only jumping on chemical, internal combustion engine, etc., but they were also catching up in textile. So I would suggest a somewhat more incremental view in which for catching up a lot of imitation is needed. Typically it's creative imitation. I mean, the Japanese imitated everything in the 50s and 60s and 70s and did so in a creative way, and then that became at some point innovation. But I don't think that nobody, and not even Brazil, can say, well, now I jump on nanotechnologies, I ride nanotechnologies, and I don't care if I don't have ICT. I think it's a failure. First of all, one should face the fact that the Brazilian industry needs to be strengthened in ICT that has had a dismal performance, also due to wrong policy of too early liberalization and opening. I was talking the other day about that. I think that some direct state intervention and some form of protection is needed to do that. Otherwise, China takes all. And if China takes all, it's also bad for the Chinese. It's not. It's bad for the Chinese because it reduces the world absorption. The world ability to absorb Chinese products. I think that the current system of unbridled globalization is untenable. Is untenable, and probably the Americans themselves will realize that it is untenable. While, of course, the Chinese will become increasingly free marketeers. Free market is a luxury that people on the competitive frontier enjoy, and people below the frontier suffer. And it has always been this way. I mean, the United States were protecting themselves all the way to full industrialization. The Germans did the same. Then you become free marketeer and you try to remake a virginity, but you look at the history, and I mean, Ajun Chang wrote masterful pieces on that. I mean, that when you are up there, then you say free market, comparative advantage, opportunity cost, etc. When you are below the frontier, you should think of learning, knowledge accumulation, organization building. That I think is the answer. Industrial policies, a lot of different industrial policies, and market unfriendly policy, because as good old Ali Samson used to say, in a sense, policies in developing countries are meant to get prices wrong, not get price right. I mean, you want to get prices against that make feasible for the firm to do something that is against your comparative advantage. Because in your comparative advantage you do things that are associated with very little learning.
Bom, boa tarde, meu nome é Vinícius Ferrari, eu sou doutorando aqui do Instituto de Economia. Então eu gostaria primeiramente de agradecer pelo curso dos 2 dias e pela iniciativa da direção de trazê-lo até aqui, que para a gente é muito gratificante. Acredito quantos de nós não trilhamos os primeiros passos na economia evolucionária à luz dos textos do senhor, do texto de 82, então realmente é muito gratificante você ter contato com a bibliografia. Então, a questão que eu gostaria de colocar, o senhor comentou no primeiro dia a respeito do Uruguai, como a questão de você fortalecer a proteção legal através das patentes pode dificultar ainda mais o processo de catching up dos países desenvolvidos. A minha questão é a seguinte: no âmbito setorial, em alguns setores, fortalecimento da proteção legal não pode gerar um estímulo às atividades inovativas e aos investimentos? Complementando a pergunta, o senhor citou a questão da agricultura, a dificuldade de apropriabilidade. A pergunta que eu faço, se a gente não tivesse o fortalecimento da proteção legal dos direitos de propriedade intelectual nos anos 80 nos Estados Unidos, a gente teria hoje agricultura moderna voltada para a biotecnologia?
There are 2 questions. One on the role of IPR in catching up, and the other on the role of IPR in moving the frontier, for example, in agriculture. In catching up, they are unequivocally bad, I think. It is not that, I mean, I cannot imagine any Brazilian firm that says, I have the capabilities to search for the AIDS cure, but I don't do it because I'm not protected enough on the side of IPR. This is not on. I mean, there is no case. I think that if anything, there might be Brazilian firms that say, I've got maybe the ability to reproduce the drug, the three drugs anti-AIDS, but I cannot because big pharma is protected by IPR. And in fact, I mean, in pharmaceutical in India, the generic industry was built on the fact that legally you could not protect molecules but only processes. And since the most important thing is molecule and not processes, this was like saying India does not recognize a patent in drugs. But remember that many countries did not recognize patent in drugs until very late. Switzerland, that is the center of the drug multinational, started recognizing patents in 1988. 1988. Italy, more or less the same. I mean, I do not think that the decision to invest in search, especially in catching up country, depend on IPR. On the contrary, it's an obstacle. Now, would there be genetically modified agriculture without the appropriation mechanism of Monsanto, etc.? Probably there would be, and along a better trajectory. This trajectory, the Monsanto trajectory, is particularly unecological. I mean, it's like saying, I build something that is resistant to the atomic bomb, then I throw the atomic bomb everywhere, and only my crop will survive, which is one of the most anti-ecological trajectories that one can think of. There are conceivable many other GM trajectories much more nature-friendly that are prevented by the Monsanto dominant trajectory. So, I mean, if you want to know my thought, I think that we would live better without IPR, and catching up would be easier. With the rate of technical change identical or even higher.
Mais questões? Alguém tem mais alguma questão? Não? Satisfeitos? Então, eu gostaria de passar primeiramente a palavra para a professora Rosana Corazza, representando aqui o Departamento de Política Científica e Tecnológica do Instituto de Geociências, para agradecer ao professor por essa oportunidade.
Bom, eu estou substituindo o professor André Furtado, que precisou sair, tinha um compromisso, não pôde ficar até o final. Eu gostaria de, então, em nome do Departamento de Política Científica e Tecnológica do Instituto de Geociências da Unicamp, agradecer a oportunidade de poder receber conjuntamente aqui no Instituto de Economia o professor Giovanni Dosi, que nos brindou, então, com esse minicurso, e também estando aberto aqui a responder as dúvidas dos nossos alunos e as nossas próprias. Muito obrigada, professor.
Obrigado pelo convite. Obrigado pelo convite, gostei muito. Estou cansado, estou um pouco cansado. Né?
Exploramos muito dose dessa vez, né? Não é isso? Mas, Giovanni, muito obrigado pela sua presença, obrigado mesmo pela oportunidade de termos esse magnífico minicurso aqui. E esperamos tê-lo de volta em breve. Convidaremos.
Ok, vou
Muito
fazer,
obrigado.
prometido.